This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nareen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. Journalists are continuing protests across the globe over Egypt's sentencing of 3 Al Jazeera journalists to between 7 and 10 years in prison. Peter Greste, Mohammed Fahmy and Baher Mohammed were convicted on Monday of, quote, spreading false news in support of the Muslim Brotherhood, deemed by the government a terrorist group. On Tuesday, staffers at the BBC took part in a 1-minute silent protest. James Harding is BBC's news director.
Well, I think there are two things. I think there's a simple thing, which is to send a message to people in Egypt. You know, this is a country which obviously, as we've been reporting on the BBC, on all news outlets, is going through an extraordinary set of changes. And this is an important principle, we think, for Egypt, but for people around the world, the principle of journalistic freedom. And we want to do that in a considered and measured way. And that's why we chose an act of solidarity, a silent protest, a way of standing alongside those people, those journalists who've been imprisoned, but to try and raise a message. In addition to that, we've drafted a letter that we're sending to President al-Sisi. It's been signed by a host of news organizations, from NBC to Sky to ITN, and we're going to be sending that as well, which makes a more detailed case. But in this moment, it was for journalists to stand with their fellow journalists.
That was James Harding, the BBC's news director. Peter Greste used to work at the BBC. At Channel 4 News in Britain and other news outlets, journalists placed black tape across their mouths in solidarity with their jailed colleagues. Online, the hashtag #FreeAJStaff has been trending for days. And the Al Jazeera reporters are not alone. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, Egypt is currently holding at least 11 other journalists in prison, placing Egypt among the world's worst repressors of press freedom.
Monday's sentencing of Peter Greste, Mohammed Fahmy and Baher Mohammed came down one day after U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry met in Cairo with Egypt's new president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the former general who led the overthrow of Mohamed Morsi last July. The Obama administration partially suspended aid to Egypt, but has avoided a full cutoff by refusing to deem Morsi's ouster a coup. At a news conference in Cairo, Kerry said he expects a full resumption of U.S. military aid in the coming months, beginning with around $575 million already released in the last 10 days. On Tuesday, President Sisi said he will not intervene in the sentencing of the journalists. While the 3 Al Jazeera journalists were sentenced to between 7 and 10 years in jail, another 9 journalists were charged in absentia and sentenced to 10 years. One of those journalists joins us now. Sue Turton is a correspondent at Al Jazeera who's covered Afghanistan, Libya, Syria extensively for the network. She previously worked at Channel 4 News in England, and she's joining us from the Al Jazeera studios in Doha, Qatar. Sue, welcome to Democracy Now! Can you respond to the sentencing in both the case of your 3 colleagues who will now spend 7 to 10 years in jail, unless there's a pardon or a commutation, as well as your own in absentia?
I think all of the verdicts left us all here at Al Jazeera quite stunned. We dared to believe that the verdict would be not guilty because we'd sat and watched the court sessions over the past few months, and we'd seen absolutely no evidence that the prosecution had brought that proved in any way, shape or form the charges against us, these charges that we supposed aided and abetted the Muslim Brotherhood, which the Egyptian authorities have now deemed a terrorist organisation. Just to slightly take you one step back, that decision to deem them terrorists wasn't made until December. And very basic point, I left Egypt in November. I'd been covering the country since the coup last summer that removed the Muslim Brotherhood from power, like many international journalists, and I'd been covering all sorts of different stories, including the protests and the politics, but I hadn't reported anything differently to all the other international journalists. And the very fact that I had left the country before the Muslim Brotherhood was even deemed a terrorist organisation makes it ridiculous that I should have been seen as aiding and abetting this group. But just to move you back to my colleagues in prison, you know, there was nothing in the evidence that proved anyway that they had done anything other than be straightforward, balanced, fair reporters. So the reaction really was one of shock and disbelief, and now I suppose it's really building to anger, to be frank.
And Sue, you said you witnessed or heard some of the court sessions, and apparently some of the evidence had absolutely nothing to do with what the three journalists were charged with. It included family vacation photos and footage of news reports from other networks and on completely unrelated subjects. So could you comment on that?
They made a big thing when they went into the hotel suite that we'd kind of been using as a makeshift office, because months before they'd raided our bureau, so we'd had to move to a hotel. But they made a big thing of leaking video of the arrest of my three colleagues, and they put ridiculous music to it. It was actually the soundtrack from Thor, this really dramatic music, with the release. And in this video, you see that they show pictures of the hard drives and the computers that were being used, and a lighting stand and a tripod and a camera. And to them, you know, this is sort of showing the evidence that was found in this, what they deemed the Marriott cell after the hotel we were staying in. And they used this evidence in court, and they basically just showed the hard drive that they'd found in Peter Greste's room. And it was ridiculous, to be frank. There were pictures from a bulletin from Sky News Arabia of a horse galloping around a paddock. I mean, you know, it would be funny if it wasn't so serious that my colleagues are now incarcerated for years on end. There were pictures, as you say, of Peter Greste's family on holiday. There were pictures of a documentary he made when he used to work for the BBC in Somalia, an award-winning documentary. And this is one of the reasons you mentioned earlier that there has been this vigil outside the BBC and many other media organisations in the last 2 days, because Peter is so respected as a brilliant journalist, not just in the region that he usually covers in East Africa, but he has been all over the world for a number of organisations. And everybody is aghast that they should have been accused of these things, let alone convicted. And I will put my hand on my heart and say the same for his other two cellmates, Mohammed Fahmy and Baha Mohammed, strong, balanced reporters that helped me enormously when I was trying to cover Cairo to understand the complexities of the story in Egypt. And these guys are now convicted with the flimsiest of evidence brought into court.